What's up, everybody? So, last weekend was a wonderful weekend for college football. You opened it up college weekend on a Friday night with number 23 Oregon State going to Washington. You follow that up on a Saturday with a Tennessee versus Georgia, Ohio State in a close battle to Northwestern, Clemson going to Notre Dame, Alabama dropping to LSU. I mean, between Friday and Saturday was full of very important games to shape up the college playoffs, to shape up these divisions and start clearing the pack out for who's the top teams and who is definitely not. But without further ado, I want to go ahead and say that today's video is going to be a recap of Week 10. It's also going to be a recap on the college football playoff update, the rankings. We're going to go over divisions, where each team lies within their divisions, how the division championship games are looking. We're going to go over the Heisman list, and we're also going to start going teetering a little bit in the area of the draft. But without further ado, let's get it. All right, y'all. Like always in every video, I always want to state I am on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, all at Sports Culture. Sports Culture Podcast. You can find me. I'm also on YouTube. Every Saturday, I always post my game predictions. I have a new live stream that I'm doing up on YouTube and on my podcast on Apple, Spotify. It'll be Saturday game day. That's where I'll go live probably about 11 o'clock to about 12 for about an hour and a half, depending. We're just going to go more in depth over the games that are happening that day, any new developing stories that has happened, post my video that I'm making for the week. Other than that, that's all the really updates I have right now. I am still working out some kinks to make this a little bit better experience for everyone that's listening and that does tune in. So bear with me. I am working around all of it. But I want to start off talking about the Pac-12. Oregon State versus Washington was a very close matchup. It was also very important for two reasons. One, in order for Washington to be considered to be in the Pac-12 championship game, they have to win out their schedule. And the reason I say that is because Pac-12 doesn't have divisions. So it's really your top two teams they play out, So with Washington now being 7-2 and Oregon State being 6-3, that helps Washington's case. But at the same time, I feel like that kind of hurts Oregon's resume a little bit. Because if Oregon State cannot, it's a weird situation with Oregon's resume, in my opinion. Because now Washington's ranked and they're 7-2. But if Oregon State doesn't get ranked and they lose, that game doesn't really mean so much for Oregon anymore. But in turn, I feel like that kind of hurts USC if Oregon State ends up having a diminishing schedule. But anyways, talking about the Pac-12, Oregon obviously beat the dog water out of Colorado. USC's having another close one in the Pac-12, this time to California. UCLA drops 50 on Arizona State. And then Utah puts 45 up on Arizona. So you're really seeing a break in the pack when it comes to these teams. I know I said in a couple videos or a couple podcasts ago that, the Pac-12 is very clustered. You don't really have a clear-cut number one guy. Well, I think after Oregon beat UCLA, Oregon started pulling away from the pack. And it's starting to really showcase that even though USC is very offensively good, defensively they still struggle. Oregon has picked up they've had games where they defensively struggle. UCLA is one of them. Well, you could say it's one of them, but they've also had a lot of games where they've been defensively strong, like against Colorado, for example, only allowing 10 points, really dominating that game on offense and defense. USC, but they got the pieces. I'm not going to say USC is a terrible team. Lincoln Riley has done a really good job with turning that program from what it was a year ago into what it is now. I mean, it's a top 10 team now. USC is going to have a lot of bright spots, and they're going to have a lot of time to shine. But right now, I don't think it's Lincoln Riley's year to take USC any farther than what they are. Utah, they are also a good team. You cannot underestimate Utah by no means. And UCLA is still not out of the conversation. I think even though how good Washington has been playing, I think you can kind of leave Oregon State and Washington out of the situation unless Washington's able to pull out some miraculous finish against Oregon this week. You can kind of leave them out. So they got to end the schedule with obviously Oregon this week, Colorado, and then their rival in Washington State. So by chance they beat Oregon, right, and they win out, they could be in. And then you guys still got to look at the fact that, you know, USC has to also lose. Utah has to win out. You know, there's a lot of situations here that will put Washington in the Pac-12 championships, but the likelihood of that's happening, I don't really see it. You know, you got Oregon and USC, if you really want to think about it, that has two Heisman potential quarterbacks. I like Bo Nix a little bit more than I like Caleb Williams. But still, at the end of the day, Caleb's in that conversation. So both teams have a potential Heisman level quarterback. UCLA, you could say, has that type of dynamic with their quarterback, but they also have a really strong running back. So for any one of these teams to drop another game, I just don't see it unless it's two, like UCLA drops to USC or USC drops to UCLA. I don't see, you know, too much crazy happening. But anyways, when it comes to the Pac-12 in general, I still have Oregon winning it. There's nothing that I've seen over the past couple weeks that really tells me any differently that Oregon's not going to win it. And then while we're on the conferences now, we're going to slide over to the ACC. And this conference is, I think it's I wouldn't say a joke, but the committee don't respect them, okay? So you have Clemson, who's number 10 in the country. I knew they were going to lose eventually, and how they lost to Notre Dame like that is something I honestly didn't expect. I thought it was going to be a fight, okay? But then NC State, Florida State, Wake Forest. Now, I don't know how necessarily they throw these rankings out, because you got Florida State at 23. But you also have Syracuse and Wake Forest, who has the same exact record, and I would say about the same exact fucking resume as Florida State. So I don't understand really too much how they determine the ranking, when you have three teams that look nearly identical on paper. I mean, there is some bits and pieces that Florida State does a little bit better, then Syracuse has some they do a little bit better, Wake Forest does some a little bit better, but overall, I mean, they are very close in margin with each other. In terms of the ACC and how Florida's 23. Another thing I want to note about the ACC is North Carolina is 15. I mean, if you have looked at the teams that are ahead of them in the rankings, you would wonder why North Carolina is still number 15. So if you take a look at the rankings real quick, you get a 2-loss Penn State team. Granted, they lost to Ohio State and Michigan. All right. You have a 2-loss Utah team who, in turn, they lost to Florida. So that's a really bad loss on there. UCLA lost to Oregon. I can deal with that. Ole Miss, they lost to LSU. I can deal with that. Okay. So now you have this number 15 team in North Carolina who should, honestly, in my opinion, now that Notre Dame's ranked and they beat Clemson, they should honestly be 13 or 12. They should be riding right outside of the top 10, in my opinion. That's how I feel about it. Anyways, before I get into the whole ranking situation, Clemson dropping like that shows that this ACC conference is not where it needs to be to compete. I don't think an ACC team, even if any one of them wins the playoffs, they're going to get into play. Or any one of them wins the championship game out of the ACC, they're not going to get in. The ACC is basically out of contention. Now, this is probably one of the toughest outside of the Pac-12, one of the toughest divisions. Well, in my opinion, the best division right now in college football is the SEC, followed by the Big Ten. Really and truly, you only have two powerhouses out of there, but they're pretty consistent when it comes to being relevant, being good, putting up the numbers, etc., etc. You know, the Big 12, like Texas, this is probably their best season they've had in like 2 or 3 years. TCU normally doesn't do stuff like that. Oklahoma is down. Oklahoma State's doing this same old stuff they normally do year in and year out. They look good, then they lose. They look great, then they lose. Kansas State's actually having a really good year. Kansas is having a really good year compared to many, and Baylor's having its typical year. But I think the reason why I say it's very competitive is because every team outside of TCU has 3, 4, 5 losses. You know, Texas 3, Baylor 3, Kansas State 3, Kansas 3, Oklahoma State 3, and then you have the Sooners who have 4, and TCU is your only undefeated team. But thing of it is, TCU has to run the table. They have to win out of their last 3. All right. And that's not going to be an easy task. You have to travel to number 18 Texas this weekend. They have to travel then to Baylor next weekend, and then bring in Iowa State. So you're asking this TCU team to travel to 2 very decent teams and take them on in their field. And it's going to be tough. If TCU can run out and win out and run the table, they're definitely in. If TCU drops any one of these games, they're automatically out of the playoffs. I'll hate to see them because I feel like they're still very highly to win their championship. But even if they win it with 1 loss, they're out of the playoffs. I wouldn't say no one. The committee doesn't have a lot of respect, I think, for the Big 12 and the ACC. So, if now that ACC has dropped their undefeated team, they no longer have an undefeated. It's on the Big 12's hands now to stay undefeated and get into that spot. But if TCU loses 1 game, they're automatically out. But now, we talked about your bottom dwellers. I really wouldn't say Oregon's a bottom dweller. They still have a lot of hope. But which Big 12 and your ACC, the teams that need to win out and stay undefeated to get in, basically are out of contention now. TCU is basically your last hope in that Big 12 division conference. We're going to roll over to the Big 10 conference. So you got Michigan and Ohio State. Both teams are undefeated. Yeah, 3-2. All right. They're going to play Illinois. I don't think there's another team that's coming out of the West. They're going to play Illinois. Then it's going to really come down to Michigan, Ohio State. Who's going to win that one? Michigan, Ohio State. If for some magical reason, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I like to talk about every scenario. I like to really sit down and discuss the scenarios that are going to happen. All right, there's 3 games left. One of them, for both Michigan and Ohio State, is versus each other. So now you have 2 games, correct? 2 games. All right, Penn State is a 2-loss team. All right, you already seen the little bit of struggle that Ohio State had last week. All right, Michigan has to play Nebraska, and then they have to take on Illinois. They should win both of them games. But in the case that they do not win both those games, and they go into Ohio State losing to either one of them, then that gives Penn State an opportunity to move up. Michigan State and Ohio, Michigan State. I am so sorry. Michigan and Ohio State. Yes, they control their own destiny. They went out, they're in. But I like to talk about all scenarios. Like I said, if they lose 2 out of these 3 games, they're very likely to allow Penn State to creep into that championship spot. Now, playoff-wise, Penn State won't get in with 2 losses. But Ohio State and Michigan cannot get cocky with it. They cannot underestimate any one of their opponents. Because Penn State's lurking. Penn State wins out, they can very likely get in if them teams lose. Now, Ohio State has Indiana, Maryland, then Michigan. They have a little bit easier of a schedule, if you ask me. For the remainder of the season. But in all likelihood, are them 2 teams going to win out? More than likely, and they're going to go against each other, and the winner of that's going to be in your playoff spot. Now, the division that's really, you can say, it's caused a lot of confusion this year is the SEC. I didn't think the SEC was going to be as good as it is. I honestly thought it was just going to be Georgia, Alabama, and then you can kind of say Tennessee. I didn't expect LSU to go 7-2, Ole Miss to go 9-1. So when you think about it, this SEC conference is extremely competitive. So you got Georgia and Tennessee. No matter what happens for the remainder of the year, as long as Georgia beats Kentucky and Mississippi State, they got it, Tennessee, they got to win out. They're 8-1. South Carolina is 6-3. I thought they were going to be 3-6 or 4-5. Kentucky's 6-3. Both teams have a likelihood of winning out. And then you got to come down to LSU, Ole Miss, and Alabama. LSU is 7-2. Ole Miss is 8-1. Alabama is 7-2, followed by a 6-3 Mississippi State team. Alabama having 2 losses, I don't believe it. I didn't think it was going to happen. LSU being in the top spot for the division, I did not see happening. But now with LSU holding that spot, this next week, or this coming up Saturday, tomorrow, it's going to be a very important day. The next couple weeks is going to be extremely crucial. Tennessee, who's bringing in Missouri. Obviously, that's going to be a win to Tennessee. You have LSU's traveling to Arkansas to take on that game. You have Vandy traveling to Kentucky. You have a lot of important games. Alabama travels to Ole Miss. Maryland travels to Penn State. I mean, this week 11 is very crucial for a lot of teams. And I'm not just saying top 10. Like, this dribbles all the way down to top 15, top 20 area. Because a lot of these teams are still in contention for their championship. Now, some of these teams are probably out of contention for the playoffs, but they're still in contention for their respective conference championship. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the rankings. Went over a little bit about how each team's standing, but I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about the rankings. I like the first one. The second one, not too much. I don't get it, honestly. So you have, okay, I get 1 through 3, or 1 through 4, really. I understand, Georgia, Ohio State, Michigan, TCU. I understand Tennessee and Oregon, 5 and 6. Where it starts getting me is LSU, USC. I can see why LSU went up to 7 and why USC is at 8. And you have Alabama and Clemson both drop. I get it. But when UCLA only losing to Oregon and Clemson losing to an unranked opponent, I feel like UCLA should move in to the top 10. I know that's a big drop for a one-loss team when you have two losses in the top 10, but UCLA's one loss is way better than Clemson's one loss. But at the same time, I guess I can see why they have Clemson at 10 because of their resume, but then if you look at the teams, they're not as good as they were when they played. But like I mentioned in an earlier podcast, I feel like the ranking system is more of who's better that week when it comes to rankings. Like, Clemson's the number 4 team in week 8, but they lose in week 9, so they're no longer the number 4 team that week, if you understand what I'm saying. And then Utah, Penn State, I already talked about how I think North Carolina should be ahead of both of them teams. In my opinion, I would have Illinois over Texas. I would also have Washington over FSU. I'll even have Kentucky over Texas. But that's no, I would have Kentucky over Texas. That's a little too much of a reach. I'll have Illinois and Washington over Texas at least, and FSU at least. And if you're going to allow an FSU team to be in, I wouldn't have dropped Syracuse out, and I definitely wouldn't have dropped Oregon State out if FSU was going to come in, if Kentucky was going to get in, because in my opinion, Oregon State and Syracuse doesn't have their resume isn't as bad. Their resume isn't worse than neither one of those teams, and they should be in. Notre Dame is now ranked, and that's one of Syracuse's losses. So if they're going to drop all the way to 20, and you're going to drop Syracuse out, I feel like Syracuse should be in. But enough of that. I'll quit mumbling about the rankings because the committee is going to do it how they want to do it. But one thing I have not talked about so far is last week's matchups. Last week's matchups was extremely crazy. Tennessee went to Georgia. Everyone was talking about how Tennessee was going to hold their own. It was going to be a shootout. And Georgia's offense is going to have to keep up. That did not happen. I watched that game. All right, Georgia dominated all 3.5 quarters. And the only thing that I had a little bit in question was, why are they playing like this? Because if you watch them in the second half, they weren't trying to go score. They weren't trying to go and put the ball in the end zone or run the score up. All they were doing was bleeding the clock. I feel like Kirby had it was in his mind. He was like, Tennessee's offense is too fast. If we keep putting our defense on there, they're eventually going to get tired. But if we drain the clock, let our defense rest, let that defense of theirs stay on the field, that's less time Tennessee's offense has the ball. And clearly it worked. They didn't score until the fourth quarter for a touchdown. He didn't score a touchdown until the fourth quarter. Ohio State struggled against Northwestern. I didn't watch that game. I seen clippets of it, and then I seen the score, and I was just like, that is crazy. How is Ohio State struggling to Northwestern? Because my main focus at the time was Georgia versus Tennessee and then Alabama versus LSU. So I didn't tune into the Ohio State Northwestern or the Clemson Notre Dame game. But I was keeping track of the score. And like I've always said, DJ's, I'm very hateful towards DJ. I don't mean to be, but he's just not the guy. He's not the guy to win the game. Now, I'm not saying K is any better. I just don't like the quarterback play from Clemson. Another game that just kept me on my toes, LSU went shot for shot for Alabama. Now, granted, I tuned in the last couple minutes where it went overtime, and it was really impressive how LSU was able to play and keep Bryce Young in check. Like, that's the thing. They kept Bryce Young. When Bryce Young was pressured, he was like 9 for 20, an interception. When Bryce Young was pressured, he could not get the ball. And that was the biggest advantage LSU had, was causing so much disruption to Bryce Young. Oregon, I've already mentioned this, Bo Nix balling out. And Clifford over Indiana, he balled out. Kansas demolishing Oklahoma State. Just completely demolished. I mean, there's not much you can do. He downright demolished you. And then you allow their running back to go 224 yards and 110 receiving. That is extremely insane. I mean, they just crushed Oklahoma State. But that is basically the Week 10 wrap-up of how the divisions lay out, how the wins influenced everything, etc. Before I get into the Week 11, I do want to talk about Heisman. Now, my Heisman list is kind of different, I would say, for this week. There's a lot of players that have fallen. There's a lot of players that have risen. And some players y'all wouldn't think have fallen. Now that it's Week 11, you basically have this week and 2 more. And now this Week 11, I'm cutting down to 5 guys. So, at number 5, I have Matt Duggan. Matt Duggan is my number 5 on my Heisman list. At number 4, I have Hendon Hooker. The only reason why he dropped from 2 to 4 is because of that Georgia game. in my opinion, from a Heisman candidate, you have to ball out against the best. If you cannot ball out against the best of the best, it hurts your case. So Hendon Hooker moves down to 4. C.J. Stroud, I'm taking him out the number 1 spot. I'm moving him down to 3. Same thing. When you go against, it's kind of the same thing with Hendon it is with C.J. When you're going against what people would say not as tough as the opponents, you're not going against like top tier teams, and you struggle, that looks bad on your resume for the Heisman. Nothing against these two players. I think they're still phenomenally good players, and if they were to go into the draft, they would be extremely good, and they're going to go high in the draft. It's just after last week and the analyzation of the season, they're moving down. At number 2, I have Drake May. I know a lot of people are going to be like, well, he doesn't play any competition. He doesn't play hard people. That's fine. You know what? Say what you want to say about him. When he has almost 40 touchdowns in total on the season, or 42 total touchdowns on the season, or whatever it is right now, I forgot to relook at it. And you're talking about C.J. Stroud and Hendon Hooker, who has 30. Drake May alone has more passing touchdowns and passing yards than both them quarterbacks. He has more rushing touchdowns than both them quarterbacks. Has more rushing yards than both them quarterbacks. Drake May has balled out. And for him not to be as high in the Heisman for everybody else, I just don't understand it. He's my number 2. He's going to probably stay my number 2 unless he does something dramatic. And then my number 1 guy on my Heisman list is Bo Nix. Bo Nix is, since that Georgia game, he has extremely improved. He's week in and week out been the number 1 guy. And I don't think there's been a quarterback better than him over the past, 10 weeks? 10 weeks, there's not been a better quarterback than Bo Nix. I would say Drake May, but I'd be lying to myself. Bo Nix, without a doubt, has been the best quarterback over the past 10 weeks. So, with that being said, that's my Heisman list. Everybody can hate me for it, come at me for it. It's okay. But tomorrow, I'll have my Saturday Game Day live on YouTube and Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I'll also be live on my TikTok. So, please tune in for that. And for everyone that's listening, I appreciate it. Thank you. Go check out my social media. Subscribe, like, follow. All of the above. Thanks. Peace out.